The side of evil in the spiritual war is not trying to win anymore. Bruce Charlton. Among all the many litmus test agenda issues, which are all very important strategies of evil, what is the most important issue for the most powerful of the demonic factions? One can only infer such things indirectly, but I think two things are apparent. The first is that the Great Reset stuff, the harmonic grand plan which purports to build upon the world coup of 2020 to create a new global totalitarianism, is increasingly a deliberate distraction from an increasingly merely destructive, spitefully motivated, agenda, focused on the Fire Nation war. My feeling is that almost everyone, even Christians on the right side of the spiritual war and litmus tests, is misunderstanding what has been and is going on across the board, but especially in the Fire Nation business. I shall try and be plain, the side of evil is not trying to win anymore. What I mean is that, at the very highest level of evil power and evil influence, they are not trying to achieve any particular end result. They are not trying to achieve a carbon zero world, not trying to cool the global climate, not trying to make an inverted world of sexual liberation, nor do they intend or hope to unite the world under a single demonic-controlled bureaucracy with a unified mass media. Nor do they intend to defeat the Fire Nation in the current war. Not anymore. All of these issues are now merely means to a destructive end, excuses for destroying whatever is of God, whatever is good, whatever is divinely created, whatever is residually Christian. They seek to destroy even whatever is simply functional, including, and this is vital to realize, that which is functional within the agenda of evil. In this respect, the Fire Nation conflict has become the single major issue for the powers of evil. While the conflict has been ignored or trivialized among some, and regarded as a traditional two-sided war of conflicting objectives by a minority of others. While all this has been going on, step by step we are being walked into all-out and uncontainable World War III, the objective of which is not victory but chaos and mass destruction on a scale far beyond anything seen in the history of the world. The pieces are already in place, and the inertial momentum is rolling, and nobody with power or influence on the side of the West has even spoken against it, never mind opposing it. Quite the contrary, the leadership class of all Western nations are united in pursuit of an agenda which will lead to the annihilation of the countries they purport to represent, starting with Europe and the UK, and extending outwards. Who knows how or where exactly? As things stand here and now, World War III gets closer every week, and will happen. We can only see what we comprehend, and if we want to understand what is being unrolled and implemented inexorably, we must first understand the nature and reality of Sorothic evil, understand its spiteful motivation and destructive aims. Which means recognizing, understanding, and repenting, that is, rejecting as evil, such impulses within ourselves. I am not claiming that this insight could happen sufficiently widely and swiftly to stop and reverse where we are heading in the world, but, for sure, nothing positive can happen, globally, nationally, in our hearts, unless understanding first happens. Because when an evil dominates the world, it is imperative that it become known as such. Note added, of course, inducing spiteful destruction and chaos is intended to win in a spiritual sense, i.e. to lead to the damnation of men's souls. Further note, the combination of military events, starting today and for a bit more than a week, would be perfect for the Sorothic escalationists to mount a fake pennant event. So perfect that it would be astonishing if some such is not planned, at some level, whether or not this actually happens. But, watch out. Epic times, titanic struggles, silent martyrs of repentance. Bruce Charlton. Ever since early 2020, we have been living in epic times, with the world engaged in titanic struggles. Yet, since such matters are neither acknowledged nor reported in the official mass media, or are grossly distorted and inverted into utter falsehood, they are invisible to almost everybody. Very few people even noticed the, I would have supposed, vast objective facts that there was a global coup in the early months of 2020 with the birdemic excuse, and that there was a colossal and gratuitous simultaneous assault on billions of people worldwide from 2021 with imposition of the, more properly, PEC. And very few noticed the newly established totalitarian world order break in two from early 2022, with one side trying to survive as nations and cultures, whereas the other side embraced and imposed an accelerated and multi-pronged self-destruction, while at the same time trying to subvert, undermine, and physically destroy the survivalist nations. The world has not seen such colossal and rapid movements and conflicts for many decades, yet this time, for most people, they are mostly ignored, when not utterly misunderstood both in terms of their significance and valence. Instead, for the mass majority, attention has been focused on completely different, often imaginary, and invented, issues. These titanic, yet largely unperceived, struggles seem often to be focused upon a series of specific persons, who are, apparently, put under extreme pressures to take the most evil of options. And they nearly always cave in. All that we can observe in the mass media is that individuals who speak out against the current agenda, or who say no when the system wants them to say yes, then either change their minds and announce the opposite, very suddenly and swiftly, or else they are eliminated from public life, one way or another. I doubt that many of these leaders, in the West, at least, are motivated by any type of positive good, but at lower levels of power it is likely that some are, or were, well motivated in their dissent, but that, unless we had personal and direct knowledge, almost nobody knows about them. These are the silent martyrs of repentance. The ones who did not cave in, who recognized their wrongdoing and repented it, the ones who are, one way or another, and there are many ways, got rid of, stripped of power, status, influence. And either nobody knows anything about it, or what people in general do know, is a slanderous lie that utterly misrepresents the real nature and motivations of the actors involved. Such are the pressure of these epic times. The titanic struggles have been, and still are, all but publicly invisible or inverted, happening at the level of specific persons, quite likely you and me, at some point, and there is no earthly reward but instead rapid punishment for doing the right thing. Right doing will be unnoticed, covered up, or twisted by power into falsely imputed evil motives and/or falsely attributed actions. Lies will be believed by most people, and tenaciously believed. Small wonder there are so few who resist, so many who persuade themselves that obedience to evil is, actually, when you think about it, good. Only those who genuinely seek recognition and reward out with this mortal life are, even in principle, capable of well-motivated behavior and thinking when under the vast, cosmic, pressures of these epic times. Love is sex and sex is love, so there. Berger. A commenter recently accused me of having many hang-ups about sex. As far as the commenter was concerned, sex opened up possibilities for elevated expressions of love between people. He then added that the gender of the individuals participating in such elevated love-sex sessions was entirely irrelevant. In his mind, the biggest problem with sex in the modern world is its vulgarization via pornography. He then noted that very few young people were having sex today before asking me what I thought that indicated. If the comment revealed anything, it is this: modern people think about sex in extremely confused and corrupted ways. I am not exempt. Nor are most of the people I know. Sex is a strong motivator. I believe it has overtaken religion as the strongest motivator in people. The only open question now is, what is the motivation aiming for? The above-mentioned commenter claims that sex motivation is actually higher love motivation. I suppose that is partially true. All the same, I am convinced that the commenter would struggle to distinguish sex from love or love from sex. For him, the two are synonymous, at least until someone films the act and posts it on the internet. Put another way, the commenter appears to have difficulty differentiating love from lust. As far as he is concerned, love is whenever two people get it on. Whether the two, or more, participants getting it on are males or females or whatever's matters not. What matters is the getting it on, and the potential higher forms of love such activity can engender. Perhaps the easiest and most effective way to think about sex, lust, and love is to think about them through the perspective of alignment with God and creation. The problem with sex is desire. Desire can come from two very different sources, love and lust. Love not only aligns with God's creative purposes, it is God's ultimate creative purpose. Love that aligns with God and creation should appeal to and motivate the deepest and highest self. It should also appeal to and motivate the beloved. It is love that appreciates beauty, admires it, nurtures it. It is love that seeks to expand creation via relationships, which, when all is said and done, is the only way creation can be expanded. Lust appeals to the lower elements within us. Thus the only love lust can inspire is self-love. Moreover, lust is often grotesque and coarse. Lust degrades beauty, scorns it, deprives it, and, inevitably, destroys it. The relationship factor is utterly corrupted. In the end, lust always diminishes creation. Simply put, love sanctifies sex, lust profanes sex. We really must begin sorting all of this out for ourselves with the guidance of the Holy Spirit. God and men. Primary and secondary creation. Bruce Charlton. If real creation exists, i.e. not just rearrangement of pre-existing stuff, then it must be a divine attribute. If men are capable of real creation, then men need to be, in some qualitative way, gods. This I accept, i.e. that men, as children of God really create and are gods. Note that God, capitalized, is the primary creator, and we men, and all other beings that really create, are secondary creators, whose real creation happens within the already existing universe of God's primary creation. The creating is therefore qualitatively the same process. When men create, they are doing the same kind of thing as God. The distinction between God and gods is therefore between making the framework, and working within and from that framework. It is also a temporal creation, in that primary creation came first. Because secondary creation is real creation, it qualitatively changes God's primary creation, including making it bigger. The above is edited from a comment in response to a post by Krista at the Authorsphere. Readers may find the difference in our views a helpful example of how metaphysical differences manifest. Krista and I essentially agree on the issues and implications, yet Krista's conclusion is the opposite from mine. Krista assumes that men and God are qualitatively different, and from this it follows that men's creativity must not be the same as divine creativity. We both agree on the nature of real creativity, but disagree on the nature and relationships of God and men. I regard men as children of God, of the same kind as God, and all men as destined, i.e. this is what God wants, to follow the same path as Jesus, who I regard as born mortal man, in unique perfect accord with God's aims and methods, who became fully divine while still mortal, and was then resurrected to immortality so that other men could follow his path by following him, i.e. follow the path of Jesus but without having first to be in unique and perfect accord with God. Krista, by contrast, regards Jesus as being one of the Trinity with God the Father/primary creator, and men as qualitatively distinct creatures from the Trinity. For me, human creativity is a manifestation, in mortal life, of the same phenomenon that will be stronger and grow in immortal and resurrected life. Men are not and cannot be the primary creators, but we can, and God wishes us to, contribute to primary creation, can change and expand it in full harmony with God's aims and methods, both in this mortal life, and much more so afterwards, assuming we are resurrected to eternal heavenly life. To make the world a better place. Bruce Charlton. I grew up, didn't we all? With the idea that the best kind of people wanted and worked to make the world a better place. This ideal has knocked around in the West for more than 2 centuries, and by now is almost mainstream, a platitude of innumerable uplifting speeches in politics, the mass media, education, law, medicine, science, the military and the police, as well as churches. Yet, see where this ideal has led us. It turns out that abstractions, such as the world and better, are, in practice, subject to colossal disagreement of definition, and are capable of infinite distortion. The worst, most evil, most destructive people are exactly those who most use the rhetoric of making the world a better place. Modern men can certainly make the world a worse place, but I see not a shred of evidence that it, whatever it is, can be bettered by such ideals. Such is reality. Methods that work well for evil cannot be used to attain good. The side of God and of good cannot use the One Ring to fight Sauron, because then they would become as bad as Sauron. If the side of good takes up the ideal of making the world a better place, as happened in all the major Christian churches of the West, then it is adopting exactly this Boromir strategy, which can only end by making the world a worse place. So, real Christians cannot allow themselves to desire to make the world a better place. And Christians should eschew such rhetoric. Indeed, what the world and better ought to mean, is precisely the major point at issue between God and Satan. The world is a calculatedly evil-loaded abstraction, and better is a weasel word. If asked, don't you want to make the world a better place? The proper response is no. Not what you mean by the world and not what you mean by better. I want, instead, to live in accordance with God's purposes and methods. Which are, very briefly, to love God, first, and my neighbor, i.e. actual individual persons, and to follow Jesus Christ. What happens to the world in some vast and overall sense, and the evaluation of what is best for it, is not my business, nor am I capable of bettering such vague abstractions. The world is God's concern. I may resist those who are trying to destroy the world, i.e. God's creation, but not by having my own alternative ideals of making a better world. Self-accusations of wishful thinking versus honesty. Bruce Charlton. One of the reasons that it is so important here and now, it was not always thus, for modern man to recognize that all possible knowledge relies on fundamental, metaphysical assumptions, that ought to be intuitively endorsed, is that otherwise we can be so dishonest with ourselves, that our entire belief system becomes distorted and incoherent. A specific instance is my own, pre-Christian, decades-long belief that death brought a total annihilation of body, mind, everything about a person. Any suggesting of anything personal, or a soul or spirit, that survived death, was blocked as obviously as wishful thinking. The dishonesty was that I actually had some such assumption myself. If I was honest with myself, I assumed that at least some people in some way continued after death. But, because I regarded this as wishful thinking, I dishonestly denied this conviction of mine. Another example was about morality. As is very common, I would come across people doing something or another to themselves, which my official utilitarian secular ethics said did nobody any harm, and therefore was not wrong. And yet, if I was honest, I could not shake off the intuitive conviction that it was wrong. I assumed, wishfully, that my own moral sense in this instance was merely socially inculcated, and therefore meant nothing. Therefore, I dishonestly denied my own unshakable moral conviction that this particular self-act was wrong, at the price of obliterating the validity of all my moral convictions. Because, after all, why had I assumed that acts done to oneself were necessarily morally neutral, whereas acts done to others were the sole proper domain of morality? What was that principle based upon? Was it not justos arbitrary, just as socially inculcated, to say that morality was only about acts affecting others, as the unshakable feeling that private acts were morally significant? You see how dishonesty to oneself is used to deal with moral incoherence, with value equals incoherence in general. And perhaps you also see that all values eventually reach a terminus at which we each, as individuals, must make an intuitive evaluation about what we personally regard as good and true. That our values are always, at root, our own responsibility, and that attempts to deny this are dishonest. And perhaps, too, you may see how corrosive to good and true values it may be, when one tries to deny this, that people can only deny it by lying to themselves about themselves, and how doing this will always have destructive consequences that will tend to ramify under cover of this dishonesty. Note added, dishonesty with oneself is commonest among the mainstream materialist ideology of the West, but is also found among those who are lifestyle religious, those who regard the main thing about religion as being particular behaviors. Further note, honesty must be distinguished from doubt. There is a state of modern doubt that paralyzes and causes despair. It often seeks relief in dishonest certainty, attained by surrender to arbitrary external authority, that is, from expediency masquerading as conviction. But doubt may also lead to simple despair, and a desire for self-annihilation. It is therefore vital to realize that honest conviction rooted in fundamental intuition is distinct from certainty, especially when certainty is assumed to entail something like 100% correctness with zero possibility of error. The search for such certainty as precondition for belief, the insistence upon a situation clearly impossible in this mortal world, is a chimera, a trap set by evil. Yet while certainty is indeed a snare, solid conviction sufficient to live, or die, by, is attainable by anyone who is honest with himself, and who pursues his surface beliefs to their intuitively endorsed roots. Spiritual Prepping, The Fable of the Ant and the Locusts. Bruce Charlton. While it is certainly provident to be prepared for short-term or focused disasters or discontinuities in the system, the commonly expressed notion of prepping is delusional nonsense when it comes to the kind of societal/civilizational collapse that threatens the West, and probably the world. The preppers see themselves as the ants in Aesop's fable of the ants and the grasshopper. When times get tough, the ants will eat their supplies and the good time grasshopper will sing until he starves to death. But this fable has it that there is only one grasshopper and plenty of ants, whereas the equivalent in the West is just a few ants, often just one ant, but a vast swarm of locusts. The fable of the ant and the locusts raises the question of whether the vast swarm of locusts will immediately lie down and die of starvation, leaving the ant to subsist on his stores and build a new world. Or whether the locust swarm will immediately eat all the supplies of the ant at their first feelings of serious hunger, and probably eats the ant himself. Some preppers make a big deal of their supplies of guns and ammo, but the locusts have plenty of those too, and vastly outnumber the ant. And some of the chief locusts also have bombs and rockets, and locusts will support their own kind. As I have said before, if things get really tough, as I believe they will, then prepping will merely serve to keep the locusts alive for a little bit longer. A man should not aspire to be a metaphorical ant, concerned only with bodily survival and reproduction, survival for what can only be a little bit longer, because all shall and should die. The prepping we, each of us, absolutely need to do is spiritual, not physical, and that means being able to discern, detect, and understand the difference between the sides of good and evil. And it means knowing when, on a timescale of eternity, there are more important things than staying alive for a bit longer than one's improvident neighbors. Furthermore, when your faith in God is strong, you will realize that the perceived material realm is merely a subset of the spiritual, and that a single man who's thinking, striving and choosing are in spiritual harmony with God, has a far more powerfully beneficial effect on the world than any conceivable number of well-armed but dubiously motivated ants ever would or could. Leftism is at the very least the pawn of Satanism. William Wildblood. It is said that evil often proclaims as such itself in some way. This may be because the law of free will dictates that if people are to be corrupted they must have some clue that this is the case. Within that criterion, though, there is ample scope for evil to disguise itself as good to the eye of one who does not wish to see beneath the surface and, on some level, actively wants to be taken in because this will justify some sin or fallen desire. In occultism, the left-hand path is the path of transgression, black magic and sexual license. Often rebranded as a shortcut to enlightenment, crazy wisdom, breaking the rules for greater freedom, rising above good and evil and other pseudo-glamorous deceptive descriptions, it is, in fact, the path that leads away from God and towards not God, which is all that rejects God and the natural boundaries and standards of His creation. This ends up, if pursued and unrepented, in a spiritual state analogous to hell, because hell is nothing more nor less than separation from God. That is a state in which light must be stolen, as the soul can no longer get it directly from God. A soul has to fall a long way before that will happen, but if it persists on the left-hand path and does not turn back to its maker, that is what will happen. The left has long been associated with the unnatural and the dark side of life. Obviously this is not the case literally, but symbolically there is a certain truth to the idea. We take our modern usage from the time of the French Revolution, when supporters of the monarchy sat on the right in the National Assembly and supporters of the revolution sat on the left. A pure coincidence, you might think, but those who are symbolically minded will see more to it than that. We are being told something. None of this means that elements of what became the revolution, which term I am using to mean the overturning of traditional ideas in the 18th century, were not genuinely progressive. Human consciousness was evolving. The relationship between all sections of society, from aristocrats to the ordinary people and between men and women, had to be adjusted in the light of greater self-consciousness. Not to mention that a new approach to religion was called for, with a greater emphasis on internal inquiry. But the whole process was hijacked and continues to be, and the clue to the hijacking was right there at the beginning. The hallmark of Satanism is rejection of God and the order of creation. This involves undermining and then inverting all natural hierarchies, and if you look at the last couple of centuries, and especially the last 50 years, you simply cannot help but see this as the underlying tendency of the left. It moves from one group to another, but always with the aim of subverting the natural order. The excuse is compassion or justice, but the real motive is resentment and even hatred of God. It would clearly be absurd to say that every leftist is a Satanist, but everyone has allied him or herself to a degree with the satanic agenda, and has done so because of spiritual failings. At the bare minimum, everyone is a dupe of some kind. And note that when I talk of Satan, I am not talking of an individual being, though there may well be such. But the prime manifestation of this impulse is the tendency in the created individual, motivated by corrupted desire and badly turned will, to want to sit on God's throne. This is what is behind the left, particularly as it is in our day. Today is not tomorrow. Francis Berger. One of the easiest ways to persuade people to surrender their freedom is to convince them that today is tomorrow. Do that, and you've not only captured freedom in the present, you also succeed in extending the captivity into the future. This tactic was on full display during 2020-2021. If you paid close enough attention and paused to take notes, you could even say you were treated to a veritable masterclass in how the rudimentary machinations of today is tomorrow work. Today is tomorrow works most effectively when constructed upon a foundation of fear or doubt. If you can scare or confuse people into believing that today's rumor, hype, anxiety, or event will inevitably extend into tomorrow and the next day, and the day after that, then you can persuade, cajole, trick, or threaten them to take action in the present for something that does not exist and may never exist in the future. However, today's tomorrow is not solely a fear and doubt problem. At its core, it is a freedom problem, the frank admission that it is best to surrender the day's freedom for the promise of a burden-free, secure tomorrow. At a deeper level, it is the relinquishment of present and future spiritual freedom. And let's not kid ourselves, spiritual freedom represents a big part of what the tactic seeks to capture, because without that freedom, we cannot create in the present or the future. And if we cannot create, we become passive and powerless. Today's tomorrow only works if we accept the dictated terms of engagement. The tactic phrase the moment we refuse these terms and stand fast in the reality that the dictated today is not and certainly does not need to be our own personal today. And that goes double for the dictated tomorrow. Today is not tomorrow. Not only that, but their today is not our today. Moreover, tomorrow only becomes theirs when we fail to show up for ours today. A very brief history of my theology. Bruce Charlton. To supplement what I recently wrote about my philosophy, I will do the same for my Christian theology. After I became a Christian, I spent about 5 years, having initially been strongly influenced in my conversion by C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, exploring the varieties of classical theology, Anglican Protestant/Evangelical, Stott, Packer etc., Anglo-Catholic, Roman Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox. Before finally settling upon Mormon metaphysical theology and philosophy, as the framework for my Christianity. Note, this is little known at all, even among Mormons, and ignored, contradicted, or overwritten by a good deal of the dominant Mormon doctrine, discourse, and practice. Within a couple of years I had substantially modified, extended and supplemented this by considerations drawn from William Arkell and Owen Barfield, and Barfield's mentor, Rudolf Steiner. The process was, pretty much, finished, for the time being at least, some 5 years ago, by my time spent focusing on reading and rereading the Fourth Gospel, with the attitude that it was the first and most authoritative source of information on Jesus' life and teachings. The resulting schema was then made simpler and more coherent, as I conceive such things, by introducing my own conviction of a wholly living/conscious/purposive created reality, constituted by beings, understood to be the primary and eternal realities of existence, and the relations between beings as what provides the structure of known reality. Christianity in Time, in History. Bruce Charlton. I was reading a chapter by R.J. Riley called A Note on Barfield, Romanticism and Time, in the 1976 Owen Barfield Festschrift The Evolution of Consciousness, in which Riley begins by making some striking and insightful points about the fact that Christianity is located in history, posits a sequence of events that are changes, and a goal, i.e. resurrection, everlasting heavenly life. It would seem obvious that the metaphysical roots, its most fundamental assumptions, would include time, not time as some kind of separable abstract entity, but time inextricably woven into the basic assumed realities of Christianity. Yet, as Riley's chapter goes on to describe, many Christians, especially among philosophers and theologians, have felt it necessary to root Christianity in the timeless and the unchanging. This decision, sooner or later, somewhere or another, leads to a contradiction, whereby the historical, sequential nature of Christianity meets up with its supposed eternal but unchanging ground. The contradiction may linguistically be reframed as a paradox, mystery, polarity, or whatever, but I regard these tactics as ultimately hypnotic word spells, intended to stop thinking. It is extremely rare to come across a Christian who accepts what I regard as the necessity to base Christianity in ultimate metaphysical explanations that sustain the need for history, sequence, change, a goal. Barfield himself was not one of these Christians. He continued to try and ground time-located/directed Christianity in the unchanging. He merely attempted this in a different place and with a different terminology, but with the same contradiction, as indeed there must always be, since a situation of change and no change cannot be combined. This feeling that changelessness, no time, is the ultimate reality, permeates Eastern religion in general, and much of Western, such as Platonism, and its developments, but it is in practice an elite concern. It seems that intellectuals, because of their propensity to speak and write in abstractions, are perhaps disposed to assume that such timeless and general entities are ultimate, and ought to regard the final goal of life as one of unchanging spiritual bliss, including an end to the thinking which is both the distinction and the curse of being an intellectual. The contradiction between the eternal and unchanging, and life, is necessarily found in all religions that include no time as a fundamental assumption, although it varies where and how this contradiction is manifest. In Christianity, the contradiction undercuts the simplicity and clarity of understanding what Jesus did and taught. In Hinduism and Buddhism, the contradiction is instead between theory and practice, because the theory states that life is irredeemably worthless in its entirety. Yet these are religions, making many discernments of values and practice, and having elaborate rituals, requirements, symbolism, etc. There are all kinds of hypnotic word spells that purport to join together the timeless and time-bound, but they are psychological manipulations, not genuine understanding. Children, tribal peoples, and simple folk often have a very different way of talking about such things, yet typically implicit and unconscious, which is rooted in the assumption that the world is made of beings, living, conscious, purposive beings, that change and may transform, but can neither be created nor destroyed, they just are, and always have been. There never has been any good reason why Christianity shouldn't share exactly this primitive, beings-based metaphysics, but explicitly rather than unconsciously and by implication. Yet the first known person to understand Christianity in this apparently obvious and commonsensical fashion seems to have been Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, from about 1830. Neither Barfield, nor Steiner his master, knew anything about Mormon theology, and did not make this inference on their own, so both remain captive to the contradiction. I regard it as a serious weakness of Christianity that the class of intellectuals and theologians have, like those of other religions, violated and overwritten the innate and spontaneous assumptions about reality, with which we all came into the world, and replaced them with something that does not make sense. Presumably, we are all intrinsically capable of recovering our original unconscious child's understanding, of making it conscious to our adult minds, and choosing to accept it as true. That sounds simple and easy, but the rarity with which it is achieved suggests that, although it may indeed be simple, it is not easy. Metaphysics never is easy to do, which is why our Western world is so deeply and widely corrupted, and still getting worse. The character of Jesus in the Fourth Gospel. Bruce Charlton. The author of the Fourth Gospel, who I believe to be the risen Lazarus, is the only person in the Bible who claims to be a witness of the last 3 years of Jesus' life and teachings, and a disciple. He is the only one who knew Jesus personally, loved and was loved by him, and so is, presumably, the single person in the best position to provide a true account of Jesus' character during the period of his ministry, death and resurrection. In the first chapters of the Fourth Gospel, there is initially more about John the Baptist than Jesus, and more of his words. Jesus only gradually gets into the narrative from a few phrases of reported conversation with the disciples and his mother, and the account of the scourging of the temple, until the interaction with Nicodemus. Even from these snatches of conversation, it seems that Jesus is enigmatic, even mercurial. He does not answer direct questions, but instead responds with a further question, or a riddle or a story. This, together with the violent actions at the temple, depicts Jesus as a confrontational personality, very much in your face, regardless of whoever he is currently interacting with. But there is another side, Jesus as prophet. These prophetic utterances are often prefaced with verily, verily, I say unto you. The first is during the meeting with Nathanael in chapter 1.
Verily, verily, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see heaven open, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man.
Jesus here introduces the term Son of Man for himself. Again we can see that, even when teaching directly, by modern standards Jesus' speech is what we moderns might term poetic or symbolic, i.e. it means more than it says, and means several things at once. The truth of such prophetic statements is occult, i.e. hidden, non-obvious to mundane understanding. Thus, when teaching spiritually, Jesus employs a spiritual, unworldly, unpractical form of language. Then, in chapter 3, when Jesus meets Nicodemus, we get a great outpouring of such Vatic teachings. We get, indeed, the essence of Jesus' work and message distilled in its entirety. And different versions of this core teaching recur several times throughout this gospel, sometimes encapsulating in a verse or two, sometimes in an extended parable teaching, such as the feeding of the 5,000 or the Good Shepherd. The impression of Jesus as a character in the fourth gospel is very striking indeed. He is volatile, unpredictable, moody, fearless, elusive, direct, kind, harsh, empathic, highly intellectual, simple like a child, each as he discerns that the occasion demands. A word for this personality type in the classical medieval astrological system is mercurial, as described by C.S. Lewis in The Discarded Image, and explicated by Michael Ward in the Narnia Code. And then Jesus may suddenly, as it were, stand tall and speak from the great prophetic heights of one who is the only begotten Son of God. Which I take to mean the first and only among all of God's children who fully understands, and is in full accord with the Creator's divine purposes and will. The one who is uniquely capable of offering a path to all men, all those who are, unlike himself, sinners, out of accord with God and desirers of death. Offering all such men a path to everlasting life on the far side of death when they are born again, all this by the simple act of believing on him. That is, approximately, knowing who he is, and following him to heaven, but after death, by being born again or resurrected.
For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He that believeth on him is not condemned, but he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God.
The already of to be condemned already, means that this is not a threat of punishment, but a rescue from the otherwise inevitable fate of men before the time of Jesus, which was to die and descend, as discarnate ghosts, to witless and depersonalized mere existence in Sheol/Hades/the underworld. There to await the coming of Jesus, and the coming of choice. Hell only emerged after Jesus, because hell is the choice of those who know, but reject and oppose Jesus' offer and gift of resurrected eternal heavenly life, which is a very different matter from passively having imposed the default state of Sheol. Chapter 3.
If I have told you earthly things, and ye believe not, how shall ye believe, if I tell you of heavenly things? And no man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man which is in heaven. And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life.
Jesus is here saying, in Vatic poetic mode, that he himself is the Son of Man who ascended up to heaven, when baptized by John and becoming fully divine albeit mortal, having come down from heaven as a man in perfect accord with God the Father, and therefore which is in heaven, even as he speaks with Nicodemus, heaven being a place or state of those beings whose natures are in full and eternal harmony with God's creative will. Note added, it is often said that Jesus wants us to become more like him. The implication is that we ought to behave more like Jesus, model our behavior on that of Jesus. I don't see it. It would anyway be impossible, and I do not believe it is true. Jesus wants us to believe on and to follow him, but surely not to behave like him, nor have characters like his character. The essence of Christianity is resurrection, which is a wholly good and eternal restoration of ourself. Heaven is full of unique characters, each contributing something unique, hence vital, not populated by Jesus copies, which would, if true, be redundant and render eternal life futile. More on the spiritual experience of direct knowing. Bruce Charlton. The idea of direct knowing has an important place in my understanding of the world, because I think it is the proper and best kind of spiritual experience for the typical consciousness of a typical modern, Western man. Another important principle is that God wishes us to be active in our spiritual lives, to be conscious, to choose our direction. Because we live these mortal lives in order spiritually to learn, i.e. theosis, and active learning is the most effective learning, when we meet life halfway, when we discern and interpret the lessons of experience. Active learning is indeed perhaps the only truly effective kind of spiritual learning. Passive learning is unconscious, unchosen, and therefore essentially irrelevant to Christian theosis, because Christianity is an opt-in religion, and cannot be imposed. Real Christianity is not a social practice nor a habit, it must itself actively be chosen, sooner or later. Putting together direct knowing with the principle of activity, I suggest that the usual way we experience direct knowing is when we receive an intuitive affirmation of the validity of some thought that we are currently thinking. In other words, we ourselves must first think the thoughts. We, by our own efforts, or explorations, need to come up with some kind of conceptual or factual knowledge, and this is directly affirmed, it is endowed with a sense of valid insight. Direct thinking is therefore not an emotion that accompanies a thought, it is a cognitive quality of validity. A recognition of such validity may be followed by an emotion, probably will, and this might be joy or excitement, or alternatively the emotions could also be shock or dread. But the apprehension of knowledge is separate from our emotional response to it. Also, direct knowing does not typically mean that we experience an alien thought appearing in the stream of our own thinking. More often the direct thinking arises in the context of an ongoing stream of consciousness, which may be very mundane and non-valid, and the particular thought is plucked out of this stream. Emphasized. Highlighted. This is the necessity of spiritual striving, because, by reading, conversation, thinking, having particular experiences etc., we must firstly have the thoughts that become recognized as direct knowing. Validity does not mean necessarily true, and, anyway, truth can only be conceptualized in a partial way, and the part is only a part of the whole creation. What is happening in direct thinking is that there is a mind-to-mind contact, at that moment we are thinking the same thoughts as another being. Most of our relationships is indirect, via communications that must be transmitted, received, interpreted. But with direct knowing, we have the experience of knowing something of another being. The value of this knowing depends on the being, but it is always valuable to know, rather than, as usual, to make indirect assumptions merely. truth or Christ? Francis Berger. Most Christians would consider the question a paradoxical non-starter for the simple reason that they regard Christ and truth as synonymous. Jesus himself reveals as much and often refers to himself as the truth. Perhaps the more precise question would be something like, what is the truth that is Christ? Or, how are truth and Christ synonymous? Or, what truth is not Christ? Ask those questions and things become interesting and controversial. I posit that the apparently paradoxical non-starter of a question that serves as the title of this post is anything but paradoxical. Contrary to being a non-starter, I believe we have reached a point in the unfolding of Christianity in which the question of truth or Christ has become an unavoidable starter question. For me, the question is fundamental, pressing, crucial, perhaps even long overdue. Fyodor Dostoevsky noted the following on the subject of having to choose between truth and Christ.
If someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth and that in reality the truth were outside of Christ, then I should prefer to remain with Christ rather than with the truth.
What is Dostoevsky getting at here? If Jesus is truth, then what sort of truth could he possibly be outside of? And if he is somehow outside the truth, then how could the truth be truth? It is worth remembering Dostoevsky provided the world with one of the best fictional explorations of this seeming dilemma in the Legend of the Grand Inquisitor chapter in the Brothers Karamazov, which I keep returning to, again and again. In the LGI, the Grand Inquisitor acknowledges that truth Jesus revealed to the world is the truth but chastises Christ for overestimating humanity's capacity to recognize and accept the truth. The Grand Inquisitor insists that people will never be able to live up to truth, consequently, the truth that is Christ had to be corrected. Thus, the Grand Inquisitor and his ilk dedicate their efforts to replacing truth with truth, of substituting Christ with miracle, mystery, and authority. People accept the truth the Grand Inquisitor offers because they believe it helps them to make sense of the world. More significantly, the Grand Inquisitor's truth provides an apparently safe and logical framework for living in the world, all without the pesky burden of personal freedom Jesus reveals in the truth. Full acceptance of the truth and commitment to its realization would shake the world to its very core. Intuiting this, people have opted to correct the truth and bring it down to earth by adapting it to the societies and laws of this world, thus diluting truth, into something pragmatic, practical, sensible, reasonable and realistic. Into something that helps people to understand this world and live in it. In this sense, there is a great deal of truth that outside of Christ. The only question that remains now is, where do you wish to remain? With truth or with Christ?